this talk, yeah, like Laura says, it's going to be about half an hour. What we can condense into that, it really is going to be a brief introduction to migration. It's a really vast subject. There's huge books on it, and I'll give some further reading towards the end of the talk. So it really is a brief kind of touch on things, and hopefully we'll sort of whet the appetite, and it's something that really is a fascinating subject. So just a couple of terms, really, a couple of things to sort of put out there, really. So there's a lot of different sort of definitions of what a migrant and a vagrant bird is. And I've tried to sort of read through and condense that into something understandable. So again, there's variations in this, but broadly speaking, a migrant bird is one that regularly moves between its breeding and wintering grounds. And this, but not always, is along something called a flyway. So you get these terms like the East Atlantic flyway. So birds that might breed in Europe migrate south to Africa, for example. That would be a flyway. And then a vagrant is a species which occurs outside that breeding or wintering ground. Those terms can be quite interchangeable. There is inevitably there's a bit of a grey area there. So, for example, some vagrants become more regular. They turn up every year, so they'll become scarce migrants. So it does all get a bit confusing. However, in this talk, Kevin and I hopefully will begin to look at some of the things around why and how do birds migrate. Why do they often end up where they shouldn't? Why do we often get birds that appear outside of that normal geographic range? Bringing it closer to home, why is Shetland, where we live here, why is it so special for those species, common, scarce, and indeed rare or really mega migrants? And then a light-hearted bit at the end, really, around just a slide or two around bird watchers, birders, twitchers, the different terminology, which is quite fun. So I thought it would be useful just to start by putting up a few things. We're probably all aware that some of the most vast distances on the planet are covered by birds on their migrations, and it's pretty spectacular stuff. So starting close to home, our own, so what we call our own T-Rex or Arctic terns, which will be arriving back in the islands in the next month or so, a bit longer, maybe 2 months. Those guys have travelled around 30,000 kilometres since they left last autumn. I remember standing in Lower Voe, watching them leave the Voe down there and thinking, where on earth are those birds going? And circumnavigating the globe virtually, it's incredible. So about 30,000 kilometres since they left. Further afield, some of the most spectacular migrations on the planet are things like grey-headed albatrosses. So between breeding seasons, with geolocation and technology now, we know that those birds can circumnavigate the globe several times. 240,000 kilometres one individual went in search of their food in 16 months. Quite incredible. And we're also seeing through satellite technology, geolocation, small transmitters that can be fitted to birds the size of a kind of battery in a watch, really. So the birds that nest on Musa, a stronghold for storm petrel in Shetland, those go out into the Atlantic Ocean and will quite happily go out and in search of food into the Atlantic currents. And travel many thousands of miles before they come back to the Brock on Musa. And then some birds that we probably don't associate with migration. So sparrowhawks, which are a relatively recent colonizer of Shetland in the last couple of decades. A bird which I was fortunate enough to go down with my dad and bring some sparrowhawk chicks back last year. And a chick that Pete Ellis rang was actually found in Highland 6 months later, 284 miles southwest. That's the first time that a sparrowhawk's been recovered off of Shetland. And it unfortunately, it was found dead. It was washed up, freshly dead, washed up on the shore. But it was 284 miles southwest So just quite incredible, some of the movements of these birds. So really, why do they bother migrating? What's in it for the bird? Well, the first thing to think about, so those photographs show blackbird, which we're all familiar with, top right, and then Shetland wren, and then a bar-tailed godwit. And it shows birds at a different end of the spectrum, really. So blackbirds and wrens especially tend to be what we call sedentary. So they don't tend to migrate very far, or so you think. Certainly the wren tends to stay around gardens in Shetland, and it'll move to the coast to forage for insects, but doesn't tend to move very far. You might think the same about blackbirds, and indeed some of them do stay. Some of them do stay around the gardens where you're living, around Lerwick, wherever really. But others do migrate long distances, which is where this kind of grey area comes in. So I was out not far from where I live in Cunningsborough the other day, and I had 31 blackbirds in one field. They're migrants. They've come in probably from Scandinavia and are searching for food before they disperse off to their breeding grounds. So even the birds we think is classic garden birds, some of them do migrate. And then the bird in the bottom left there, the bar-tailed godwit, well, that's a bird, a wading bird, again on the other end of the spectrum. So you might not be able to make out the map in the middle, but that's just broke the record for the longest single migration of a land bird last year. Went from Alaska to Australia in one hit. It didn't stop. It just went the whole distance in one go, 13,000 kilometers, quite staggering. So as I've said, not all birds migrate. Some are more sedentary than others, but it is that kind of continuum, and there is this big variation within species. And they really do that because it's advantageous to do so. It will take them to more favourable breeding grounds during the breeding season, better food supply, better chance of breeding success, and vice versa in the winter. So it'll take them to more favouring wintering grounds. That might be better food supplies, it might be warmer, and fundamentally all that it enables better population survival, subscribing to Darwin's theory really of evolution. Some birds, and we'll touch on this a bit later, I think, do move directly in response to food supplies, certainly the lack of them. So you might get birds coming from Scandinavia if there's been a shortage of berries, or a shortage of beech mast, or a shortage of pine cones. Then they do move down to southern areas like Shetland and further south indeed. So you can get these kind of eruptions. That's a sort of form of migration in itself. So a good question is, well, how do they know? How do they know where to go? This is a real interesting area of science, and it's still really evolving. But what we do know is that birds kind of are born with a clock and a compass. A clock and a compass, those two key attributes in their brain. That is imprinted genetically. So when juveniles, when birds first hatch out the eggs, the only way they can really know how to get, say like a wheatear hatching out of the nest here in Shetland in the summer, how does it know to get to sub-Saharan Africa? Well, the clock and the compass will be genetically imprinted in those brains. Some of them as well pick up. We think that some birds are learning, whether it's through communication. So the picture there of the Mount Shearwater and its chick. Those chicks take a good couple of months really to develop to the point where they can leave the nest. So during that time, they're probably learning, they're watching, they're looking at the stars, they're probably communicating with the adult and finding information, and that's kind of registering in their brain. We know that the sun is really important as well, but more particularly the polarized light associated with that sun. So I'm told that if you look at your laptop now, a white part of the screen, and tilt your head to the right, you might see some blue and green kind of images. That's the polarized light from the sun. So obviously the sun can only be seen by birds when it's visible, if it's cloudy or if it's hidden for whatever reason. that becomes less of a tool for the bird. So this polarized light becomes important. And we also know that stars, so the constellation is really important as well. The position of the North Star is critical to these birds, and they're probably learning that. Some of the species are learning that the constellation before they even leave the nest, which is quite fascinating. And we know some of this information through some research that was mainly done, kind of started in the 50s. It probably wouldn't get away with this sort of research now, but they kind of manipulated birds in a planetarium, and they varied the constellation of the planetarium, and they were able to see where those birds were moving, and they were responding as they changed the constellation, as they flipped the hemisphere. Some of those birds readjusted in cages to actually migrate in a different direction. So that's where we know that the stars are really quite important here. An interesting study they did with Mount Shearwater is a chap called David Lack from Skomer. They again, this research wouldn't be allowed now, but they took a Mount Shearwater, an adult, out of its burrow and put it in a bag. Skomer off West Wales. They put it in a bag, and then they took it to London, and then they flew it from London to Boston in America, and then they just let it go. They let it out the bag, and it flew out into the night sky at Boston Airport. It got back to its burrow on Skomer quicker than the letter they sent to London to say they'd done the experiment. So that's a pretty amazing story, how powerful these birds are. The other thing we know is important for migratory birds is the magnetic field, so the position of magnetic north. And we know that birds have got this ability to be able to register where magnetic north is and deviate their flight path in response to that. Again, as I say, this kind of area of research really is developing, but we know with manipulation of magnetic field that it has got an importance to play. And the other thing is, birds mature as they get older. They will migrate according to distinctive objects. So these stacks on I think out on towards Eashness on Shetland are kind of distinctive to these birds. So as they come into their area where they know that their nesting site might be, for example, they'll see familiar stacks, and this will bring them closer to home. Once they know they're in the general location, they'll be able to fix on a point and go by these distinctive objects. And in reality, Kev and I were talking about this the other day, they probably use all those in ways we don't really understand, that we as humans don't understand. So they probably use all of those going on in their tiny pea-sized brains all at once. So, and this kind of science really is still evolving. So just briefly, why then do they end up in the wrong place? Again, there's a number of theories on this. We know that weather plays a really important role. So Kevin will come on to this in a second, but we do get these what we call overshoots or overshooting migrants in spring. So they're birds that have moved up from Africa. They should be stopping in kind of Europe, so sort of southern Europe, some of them, but they just carry on. They might have a southerly wind behind them, but they might end up in Shetland. So things, exotic looking things like bee-eaters or hoopoes, they might end up in Shetland, and they're the classic kind of overshoot spring. They've just gone basically too far. And then we can get some quite exotic vagrants coming over right the way across the Atlantic from the States, particularly in the autumn when Florida gets battered by and parts of the Caribbean get battered by storms, hurricanes that kind of go up the eastern seaboard and then rush out into the Atlantic. They can drop birds into Ireland, into southwest England, Hebrides, and indeed Shetland. And we think there's growing evidence that some species have actually got this kind of genetic malfunction. So in some way, their brains are reprogrammed wrongly right from when they hatch out the egg. Their brains are 180 degrees in the wrong way around. So instead of in that diagram there, the red arrow a species moving southeast actually tracks northwest instead, 180 degrees in the wrong direction, this so-called theory of reverse migration. I think it's naive to think that all these birds just don't know where they're going and they get blown off course by weather. Some of this is definitely around purposeful migration and population expansion, survival of the species. We're certainly seeing that as there's changes in with climate changes, changes in emergence of insects, for example, in our broadleaf woodlands in across the UK. Birds are arriving at slightly different times. They're going to have to adapt to food changes and insect availability, and that migration will play a part in that. And probably again, similar to before, all three of these factors are at play. Kevin, if I could hand over to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So how does that all play out then? So there's two sort of distinct seasons of migration, really. There's spring migration and autumn migration. They're the two main segments, if you like, of a bird's calendar in terms of movements. And in sandwiched in between that is obviously the breeding time for those birds that are sexually mature. And the two very different types of migration as well. So spring tends to be that movement of birds heading straight back to breeding grounds. So there's a real urgency to get back. So there tends to be very short stays at stop-off points while they feed up and be in peak condition to get back to breeding grounds. And then in autumn, there tends to be a far greater number of numbers of birds around, because there's juveniles which have obviously been bred that year, have been raised that year, so they join those adults as well in terms of the numbers that arrive in different places. So in terms of Shetland, how do we get these different species? As Matt said, weather is one of the factors that plays a part, and what that'll be a lot of the time is birds heading from south coming back north into Northern Europe, up to Scandinavia, etc. They'll set off in ideally when there's a nice high pressure system over the continent, means they can make good headway without hitting bad weather. But what often happens is, as they're making that journey, they'll hit a fast moving or slow moving low pressure system, which means it's normally drizzle or rain, and that they land, basically they need to come down rather than fly through that. And that's where, with an easterly airflow, you get those birds, the vast numbers of birds moving through Central Europe. They will then be pushed across into the UK and then onto the Scottish Islands and up to Shetland as well. And we often get massive, what people call falls of common migrants. That's big numbers of arrivals of common migrants. And some of those species you'll all be familiar with. So things like chiffchaff can arrive in vast numbers, willow warbler, lesser and common whitethroat, blackcaps, garden warblers, and pied and spotted flycatchers, amongst many other common species of migrants as well. And then Shetland is well positioned to receive lots of other scarce migrants that don't breed in the UK or do in very small rare numbers. They are more abundant in Northern Europe and Scandinavia. So things like wrynecks, redback shrike, bluethroat, they are moving in vast numbers from their southern wintering grounds back up to their breeding grounds, and that easterly airflow is what is needed to make them arrive in the UK and indeed on Shetland shores. So, as I mentioned, yeah, that longevity is very different in spring and autumn between the two species, because of that urgency to either get back to breeding grounds, or in autumn, there's less of a rush to get back. It's really about ambling back to the wintering grounds. So birds tend to stay a little bit longer in autumn, and there's obviously an abundance of birds, as I mentioned, those first year birds, those newly born birds join the adults as well. Spring's also very different in terms of how the appearance of birds changes as well. So in spring and summer, everything is in their breeding plumage, or their summer plumage, which is really looking as fine as possible, which tends to be, in most species, the male looking very bright to attract the female, and the female being slightly duller for camouflage for the nest. That not always the case. We do have some special species in Shetland where that role is reversed, such as redneck phalarope, where the females are the bright ones and the males do the incubating. So it's always whoever's the responsibility is of that incubation tends to be the duller, more camouflaged, and the other one is the more brightly coloured one to attract a mate. And And what they do in spring is race back to those areas to set up their breeding territories as well. So that's when you'll get birds singing as well. And you often get them singing on passage. So even when they haven't quite arrived at their final breeding destination, you may get a species singing here. You may hear marsh warbler singing in spring or icterine warbler, and they're not back at their final destination yet, but there's just that urge to show, look, I've survived and I'm doing well, and if there's a mate out there that's suitable, then I'm in peak condition. So you get that real spectacle as well in spring, added to the movements as well. And as Matt mentioned, with the overshoot element of some of the species that we've got coming over, some of them is absolutely about setting off with that high pressure and a southerly airflow, and they just keep going. They don't hit that low pressure system, so they keep going, and then they've overshot their mark of where they need to go. And some of them is actually seeking better conditions or habitats. Certainly been well publicised in areas like southern Spain. Cota Doñana, famous place down there, is becoming drier and drier every single year due to the practices locally there. Siphoning off water for local uses means that lots of wetland species there that would have been in vast numbers, such as egrets, ibis, etc., they are now making journeys further north to try and seek out better wetlands and better habitats. And some of them, it's purposeful journeys, and that's why we've had relatively recent colonizers in the UK with great white egrets, little egrets, massively abundant now and very widespread around the UK. Glossy ibis now breed in very small numbers, little bittern, and lots of other particularly southern species. Hoopoe bred last year as well. Bee-eaters have colonised on a couple of years on the run. So there's lots of really what we class as typical Mediterranean style species that are starting to adapt to that climate and obviously the temperature as well, and the condition when they arrive at sites, with the food abundance being there as well, is meaning that they can survive and breed in those areas better than they used to. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Kev. And that's a male Siberian ruby throat. Was that taken on? Was that your picture, Kev?
It was my picture, yeah. That was taken on Fair Isle. Yeah.
Excellent. Which brings us on to, why is Shetland so special? So just a little bit of around why Shetland, why living here is so good for these migratory birds and vagrants. Well, several points really may seem obvious, but it's good to state them anyway. Geographically, we're well placed to receive birds from anywhere. So we all know quite well, we're 12 hours on a ferry or a 10-hour plane delay from anywhere. So it's we're well placed to receive birds from the east, from the south, and from America even. And I think it's worth saying as well, some of the smaller islands, so Outscare is a particular favourite of mine, Fair Isle, Fula, and so on, or even more so. So they're even more isolated, and they'll provide somewhere, if a bird's high up flying over off course, they can land on those places because they're geographically isolated. And within those areas, excuse me, birds are channeled in further still. So the geography, the layout of the crofts in Shetland are such that they're quite sort of fragmented in many parts of the islands, and you get these kind of small gardens where birds will funnel into or channel into. So any of these small areas of gardens and scrub, Kurgord, those sort of wooded areas, the Jossiter Burn, for example, birds will get funneled into there because that's where they can find shelter. That's where they can find food in the form of insects. And there's a long history of migration studies here. That's Eagle Clark. That's my clock going off. That's Eagle Clark. He first pioneered Fair Isle as being one of the most important migration sites in Britain in 1948, and the Bird Observatory was opened in 1948. So there's this long history of Shetland and the islands being very good for migrants and being important for migratory birds. And I'd like to say that there's some good birders who live here. There's some birders who sit on the rarities committee or have done in the past, and it's got, there's some good guys out in the field, but it is quite sparse coverage. As you know, it's a vast place, and sometimes it's difficult to know where to start. I certainly find that sometimes it's quite overwhelming to know where to go and look. Over to you, Kev.
Yeah, so just a little bit about ringing and how that plays its part. So as Matt mentioned earlier, we've been able to find out quite a lot about birds, and ringing plays a big part in that. And it still is relevant. It's one of these things now with growing technology such as geolocators and GPS and lots of other devices that are getting smaller and smaller in technology and have been able to use on birds, that ringing is not become an obsolete practice. It is still really useful, mainly colour ringing for certain species. It's incredibly important for waders particularly. You can easily see their legs. It's a great citizen science. Anyone can potentially come across a colour ringed bird and then feed that back. And all this data is captured in one big spot. So it's all coordinated by the BTO, the British Trust for Ornithology, and they collect all that data from every single bird that's been ringed. And ringing takes place by, for those of you who don't know, licensed ringers. So people have to go through training in order to become a ringer. And what it basically is, most of the time, is a different trapping method in order to get the birds, and then they weigh them, they take biometrics, they would check the condition of the bird, they would obviously put a unique ring on it with their own code, and then that bird would be quickly processed and released as soon as possible. And once that bird is released, some of the recoveries we get back from these species, if they're trapped elsewhere, or they've hit a window somewhere, or they've died somewhere, then we're able to find out a little bit more about their movements. And the benefit of ringing in that way as well is not just the knowledge of where these birds go, it actually helps some of our conservation work. It helps policy as well. So the key thing is, for example, some work done with storm petrels, geolocators, storm petrels. We know that some of the journeys that they've made, they make incredible journeys from Musa all the way down to southern Africa, lingering off the west coast of Africa there. But what they also pick up is where they forage as well. So where those birds would feed, and that shows whether they're going to come into conflict with any sort of offshore wind proposals, with any oil rigs. They're obviously drawn in by the flames sometimes in areas like that. So it just shows that overlap of where foraging areas are with potential conflicts, and then how that can be safely mitigated against or managed. And even on a smaller scale than that, it often shows on a particular flyway where there might be issues of illegal trapping or other sort of spirillous things which could cause problems for birds. I was just over in Thailand recently helping our Thai partners on a sabbatical, and fortunate enough to be involved in satellite tagging one of the rarest waders in the world, spoon-billed sandpiper. And that will be fantastic to now have 2 new birds satellite tagged from Thailand there to map their journey of where they go along that flyway, and hopefully unlock some new wintering areas or stop-off areas that we don't know about that would help international management and protection as well to secure those areas. So just briefly on the pictures here, a trap up at the top there is called a Heligoland trap, named after the island just off the coast of Germany. And that is a bird observatory itself, Heligoland. And basically how that would work is, this one in particular is on Fair Isle. His birds would go in along the wall into the mouth of the netting there, essentially into the trap. They've often got trees in there as well to draw the birds in. And then a person would operate that by walking into the trap and pushing the birds essentially down to the end. There's a clear glass box at the end. So the bird makes its way for that. You just pull a little rope, the bird goes safely into the box, and then it's captured. So they're a great way of catching birds safely when it's too windy to erect a mist net that you can see on the right hand side. They work brilliantly in calm conditions. Bird just flies into the net, puts itself into a pocket, and then a trained ringer is able to extract them quickly from the net and then start that processing. As you can see in the bottom corner there, the processing of birds. So they're stored in individual bags just to minimize that stress, and then they're quickly processed by the trained ringers. But it feeds into lots of different aspects of knowledge that we've got from birds' movements, but also as well into how we can still continue to improve things for birds as well on their journeys.
Thanks, Kev. So I just thought I'd show a few pictures now of some of the birds that turned up in Shetland to illustrate what we've been talking about, really. Last autumn, 23 was incredible, even by Shetland standards. The number and variety of species spread across the islands, was truly amazing. So all these photos are taken on Shetland. The one in the top left is a Pallas's grasshopper warbler. The one in the middle is a white thrush. That the Pallas's grasshopper was on Nos. The white thrush was on Bresse. The middle one is the Western Olivaceous warbler. That was the first ever for Britain. That was on Walser. And then red-tailed shrike in the bottom left was on Fair Isle. Now, these species are sort of eastern or southern in origin. So the white thrush, really, Kevin would have probably seen those in Thailand, or certainly later in the year you would do. And so they're completely, they would be, all of these would be classed as vagrants, really scarce, really rare vagrants. Should be in China, possibly reverse migrants, possibly coming over in a big easterly airflow, probably a combination of the two. Then this one is a yellow-browed warbler. Some of you might have seen this even in your gardens around Lerwick, in any garden with any small bush in, really, or even not. They'll even go along walls, dikes, anywhere where there's pallets, things like that. Anywhere where there's likely to be shelter and insects, the yellow-browed warblers might be in the autumn. And this really breeds in kind of Russia and should be migrating southeast into China, but actually turns up in quite large numbers over in Scandinavia, Shetland, and indeed throughout the UK. And again, this could be one which is a classic kind of got itself the wrong way around 180 degrees and is one of these classic reverse migrants. A couple of other birds, some of you might have seen some of these. It was a really good year for scarcities for these scarce birds in Shetland last year, and even into this year. So some of these birds are still around now. So the one you probably recognise, the blue tit in the left there were some good numbers of that. All of these will probably be from Scandinavia. So they will have come down looking for food, just come out of Scandinavia, come into Shetland. And blue tit, I think there was 4 reported the other day still in around Helendale, around the Clickham Lock there. So they're doing well. They'll survive the winter. Then there's a tree creeper in the middle. Again, that's probably from Scandinavia. That was again in Helendale, so that nice wooded area around there. Again, that was present until fairly recently. And then one we're probably all familiar with, the waxwing, that would be an eruptive species. So if there's been a poor berry crop in Scandinavia, they'll move south, often in big flocks, to find berries. And in Shetland, when I was living up at Olibury, I put some apples out, and lo and behold, a few waxwings came down to the apples. So that's a nice one. That's pretty much, there's some years, so you get these eruptive migrants. Some years there could be hundreds, others there might only be a few. But last winter was particularly good for them. And then finally, these are Nearctic or American vagrants. So the veery in the middle, a small little thrush, that was up by the Lunna Kirk for over a week, just foraging there, showing really well. The greyish bird in the middle, like the sparrow, that's a white-crowned sparrow. That was on Fettler about the same time. I think it turned up pretty similar time in October, those two, the veery and the white-crowned sparrow. And then personal favourite of mine is that beautiful bird in the bottom right, is a yellow warbler. I spent quite a lot of money going to Fula to see one. And then one turned up in Sanic about 2 weeks later, but doesn't matter. So I saw two in 2 weeks, but fabulous birds. So that should have been over. That was migrating from North America down the eastern seaboard, and probably got caught up in one of these hurricanes quite early on, because that's quite interestingly quite an early migrant in the States. That migrates from north to south in sort of August time and into September, and indeed these birds turned up quite early in September in Shetland. Just sort of finally, really, I mentioned at the start, this is a brief introduction, very much so, to migrants and vagrants, and there's a lot of further reading out there. I've tried to pick out sort of what I think are probably three of the best books, really. So the one in the sort of right hand side, as you look at it, is Rare Birds in Britain and Ireland. That's David Cottridge and Keith Vinicum. it's got a really nice introductory section on vagrancy, and I recommend that's really accessible and quite easy to understand. Plus, there's some lovely photos in there. Bird Migration, the light blue book on the left, that's Ian Newton's. I mean, that really is the kind of Bible. It's a big weighty tome. It took me actually 9 months to read it. I think it's not a bedtime read. There's a lot of stats in there, a lot of maths, but it really brings everything together and provides a fantastic insight into migrants and vagrancy. And then more recent is James Lee's and Adam Gilroy's book on An Introduction to Vagrancy, and that's again got a nice chapter, more up to date, with things about magnetic field and so on. So any of those books are really worth it if you're particularly interested. I thought I'd just finish with a slide a little bit about bird watchers. Some of you will know some of this. Some of you might not, but some of you will have seen groups of birders around, particularly in the autumn in Shetland, and wonder what all the fuss is about. Well, hopefully I can explain a bit about it, really. So there's this terminology, which again is like a bit of a continuum, I think. There's bird watchers, bird fanciers, bird watchers, birders, and twitchers. Twitchers tend to be at the excessive end of the spectrum. Kevin and I might disagree about some of this ourselves, but I'd certainly say that, you know, you can't say that all twitchers, all those fanatics are rubbish birders. Some of the best birders I know, some indeed who were leaders in the field, were top twitchers as well. And I'd contest that most of us do twitch in some way. If someone tells you there's a waxwing showing really well in Tesco car park, you might drop everything and go and see it. Well, that's a twitch. Someone who flies to Shetland from Bristol might that's a bit more extreme, but that's twitching as well. But I think there's a serious note, really, that some of those twitchers right at the end of the spectrum will do anything to add a new bird to their list. They really can cause some problems, and there has been some. It's always highlighted, usually in the Daily Mail, actually, about problems that the groups of twitchers have caused. But it doesn't happen often. It's not the norm. And those pictures down with the crowds of people, yeah, I've just put in there. That's not Shetland. The picture down on the bottom left was actually an eastern crown warbler in Durham in northeast England about 10 years ago, and the one down at the bottom right, I think I might be in that picture, that was for a golden wing warbler in Kent in 1989 when it actually stopped the bus. There was about 3,000 people there, so that did cause a problem. And I think really, again, some books some suggested reading, really. There's a really good book by Mark Cocker called Birders, which really explains what makes birders and twitchers in particular tick, and where their kind of motivation comes from. That's really a nice book. And then rather more light-hearted is one of Bill Oddie's first books, his Little Black Bird book. It's hilarious. He's got some really nice, that's his own illustrations, some really nice sort of tongue-in-cheek things around different types of bird watcher. And there is a Shetland Birder Code of Conduct, which we helped, my predecessors in RSPB helped to put together in conjunction with the Shetland Bird Club, which just kind of is common sense, really. It talks about following the countryside code, talks about shutting gates, and things perhaps that are a little bit more individual to Shetland. So knocking on people's doors, explaining what's happening. Most people, in my experience, will be interested. They'll be interested to know, well, there's a crowd of people in the garden. I was in Leavenwick a couple of years ago, and there was a Swainson's thrush from America and a Blythe's reed warbler from Europe, from Eastern Europe, in the same garden. And that there was a crowd of guys there, and no one had gone and explained to the ladies whose house it was what was going on. And actually, she was really interested to know what we were all doing there. So I think that's really important. And I think on the last note, really, I think hopefully what we've briefly illustrated with this presentation is just enjoy the variety of birds that Shetland receives, not just migrants and vagrants, but the breeding birds as well. We're getting through a long winter now, and hopefully coming into spring, things are starting to change and birds are starting to sing, and it's only going to be another sort of month, 6 weeks until we start getting some of these southern European species coming back. So celebrate where we live, because it's a great place.